This should give way.
If, like me, you feel that action in VR has more potential than just running around shooting guns, then you may be interested in what the Wizards' Dark Times has to offer. Following up on the moderately successful original, The Wizards, developers Carbon Studios are back again with their signature gesture-based spellcasting to see if they can conjure up some magic the second time around. Will they succeed in casting a spell over gamers this time around? Or will Wizards' Dark Times prove to be nothing more than a charlatan peddling a cheap bag of tricks? Let's take a look. Nothing up my sleeves. Hey presto! The Wizards' Dark Times sees you play the role of, you guessed it, a wizard.
Begone!
Set in a fantasy world called Meliora, Dark Times continues the player's journey as the unnamed mage from the first game. You play once again accompanied by the overtly glib and entirely formless Aurelius, the dryly sarcastic narrator from the first game. But don't worry if you haven't played the original, there's nothing so in-depth and convoluted within the plot that you need a refresher course. Essentially, there is evil magic afoot and it's up to you to stop it. There is more to it than that, but at the same time, there isn't really. After a fairly short amount of dialogue-based exposition, the player sets about traversing the corrupted lands of Meliora in order to undo the effects of dark magics that have beset the land. It's not terribly complicated, but you know what? That's fine by me. As far as the broad strokes of gameplay go, the Wizards' Dark Times is no different to the likes of Star Wars Tales from the Galaxy's Edge or Warhammer 40,000 Battle Sister. The player is treated to a bit of dialogue, which inevitably leads to a light puzzle or a combat set piece. Rinse and repeat. Although it's not groundbreaking, there are a few nice touches throughout that mix up the gameplay. I particularly enjoyed the level where it rains constantly, rendering your primary fireball spell completely useless. There's also a level which forces you to play one-handed, limiting the spells you can use and forcing you to change your playstyle considerably. It's a fun way to add a little variety. Where Dark Times really sets itself apart from these other narrative adventures is in the unique spellcasting mechanics that make up the combat. The combat in the Wizards franchise is unlike any other game on the Quest, and it's utterly joyful to play. Over the course of the game, the player will learn 11 spells that will have you summoning magical weapons and mastering everything from fireballs to lightning blasts. There are 6 core spells, each triggered by their own unique gestures, and an additional 5 empowered versions of these core elements. The gestures are responsive, intuitive, and fun to use. The spells themselves are different enough in range, damage, and effect to make each of them useful depending on the situation. Combat gets even better once you get a bit of confidence with the mechanics, and you find yourself launching combos, strings of gestures that run from one to the other, leaving a trail of magic in your wake. It's some of the most fun combat that I've had in VR, and had the other elements of the game been executed at this level, this may well have been one of my favorite games. My only complaint on this front is that there is one spell in particular which is definitely overpowered. I avoided using it unless absolutely necessary. However, if you wanted to, once you learn this spell, you could simply spam it over and over again and basically just walk through the rest of the game. Graphically, the Quest version of the Wizards' Dark Times attempts to replicate the look of its PC counterpart, but misses the mark on a number of key points. While the environments provide a fair representation of a mythical fantasy world, there are some distracting technical issues that occur throughout which sadly distract from the gameplay. Most notable is the way that assets pop in and out of existence. This occurs with an annoying regularity, and although not game-breaking, it does limit the immersion considerably. Additionally, the visual effects that accompany magical attacks and some of the general background ambience are a little flat and underwhelming. This is particularly evident as you cast the fireball, essentially the player's primary weapon. It's really hard to describe, but there's something about it that looks just a little off. like a three-dimensional effect has been misaligned around a two-dimensional circle. It's quite disconcerting. I found that in order to get immersed, I had to force myself not to look at that particular spell. The lighting is also a little inconsistent, with the fireball spell lighting the way in some dark areas, and then disappearing sadly into the void in others. Similarly, objects, enemies, and pathways seem to appear out of a poorly executed gloom that seems to exist for no other reason than to reduce the amount of assets rendering at any given time. That said, there are some areas and effects which look quite good. Overall, it's not terrible, more mediocre, when you compare it to games like Tales from the Galaxy's Edge, which has some similarities in scale in the outdoor aesthetic. The world in Wizards' Dark Times just lacks the polish and depth that the quest is obviously capable of delivering. The audio in the Wizards' Dark Times serves as an entirely adequate complement to the gameplay. The enemies each have their own groans and grunts to indicate their presence is nearby, and the spatial audio filters these sounds to the players well enough to get a feel for what's happening around you. That said, there are such a limited number of enemy types that I feel like a bit more effort could have gone into their sound design. It's all perfectly acceptable, but I can't help but think that a little more character and variety in the enemy sounds would have really gone a long way to adding some more tension in the moments in between combat, and it definitely would have added some more depth to the experience while in battle. The music plays its part in deepening the atmosphere, with grand crescendos escalating as the combat ensues, only to fade away to indicate the last of the threats has been vanquished. Outside of the ebb and flow of battle, the music occupies a supporting role, adding just enough to prop up the atmosphere without becoming intrusive. It's hardly the highlight of the game, but it serves its purpose. Now, I'm not usually a fan of the quipping for quip's sake style of narrators in games, but it does work well in the Wizards' Dark Times. This is in no small part due to the quality of the voice acting. It's really rather good. Although there are only 3 speaking roles in the game, they're all performed admirably. The Wizards' Dark Times is, at release, a single campaign with a finite beginning and end. Personally, it's quite hard to give an accurate runtime for Dark Times, given how many hours I've spent in the PCR version's arena mode. As a result, I breezed through my playthrough this in just over 2 hours, only dying once. But it should be noted that I did that by bypassing the game's natural learning curve, having already become widely proficient in the game's magical combat. My first outing with Dark Times took me somewhere between 4 and 5 hours to complete, and as the Quest version seems to match the PC VR in level design, enemies and content, I see no reason that this game should clock in below 4 hours for the average player. If, however, like me, you're an experienced spellcaster, expect to blast through this swiftly. With only 6 enemy types to go toe-to-toe with, and 2 quite mild difficulty settings, I can see that many people will put this game to bed after the first playthrough. I cannot stress what a shame that would be. The combat is so much fun that it begs for an arena or a roguelike mode. Well, the good news is that this is on the cards, with Carbon Studios not only working on delivering an arena mode, but a special co-op arena mode featuring new enemies to boot. I can only score the game on the content available as it launches, but when the multiplayer arena mode lands, in the immortal words of Arnie, I'll be back. The Wizards' Dark Times is a narrative-driven adventure game that offers a unique spin on the oversaturated shooter genre. Rather than taking on your enemies with traditional weaponry, the Wizards introduces a gesture-based spellcasting system which is unique, intuitive, and refreshing to play. The game suffers from a few technical issues which hold it back from excellence, but the ability to throw magic around to dispatch foes instead of the current endless barrage of pew-pew is more than enough reason to give it a try. As it stands, it's a perfectly solid way to spend a few hours, but when the promised co-op arena lands, the Wizards' Dark Times will really come into its own. Seven.